Trigger warning. This program will discuss state-sanctioned sexual violence and the bureaucratic dehumanization of captives. The language that follows strives to be precise, clinical, and dignified. Reader discretion is advised. Imagine a triumphal march into Rome, banners snapping in the sunlight, soldiers in harnessed order, the thunder of legionary feet against paved stone. Senators line the route, the populace cheers. Marble monuments will later remember the victory, the names of generals, the spoils of war, the carved scenes of battle. Between the columns, however, there is another procession, quieter and less likely to be carved into stone. Chained women walk with heads bowed, their clothing torn or removed for spectacle, their faces hollowed by exhaustion and humiliation. They are displayed as evidence of conquest, trophies that convert military success into civic prestige. What official narratives of glory hide is not a single isolated outrage, but a system, an organized administrative machinery of capture, assessment, transfer, sale, and institutional use that turned living people into taxable, marketable assets. That is the shocking truth this investigation confronts. The spectacle of parade and triumph is only the opening scene. The deeper story is procedural: capture on campaign, ritualized humiliation as political theater, bureaucratic paperwork that formalizes ownership, branding and inventorying like cargo, transport that tolerates high mortality, marketplace inspections akin to livestock sales, and legal and medical texts that normalize the exchange. Surviving documentary fragments, from military reports to ledgers, from graffiti to physicians' notes, assemble a pattern that is chilling in its banality. This is not the crime of a few rogue soldiers, but a series of institutional mechanisms that sanctioned and profited from the sexual subjugation of women after battle. Capture and ritual humiliation were rarely chaotic after the first shock of conflict. Contemporary accounts and administrative records suggest that conquest was followed by an orderly sorting. Women were separated by cohort or company, moved to the center of the city or to staging grounds outside the camp, and the public nature of their exposure was deliberate. Stripping or forced disrobing in view of the populace served as a political signal. The enemy had been not only defeated but stripped of personhood. In the language that survives in administrative glosses, there are references to selection practices. Some captives were chosen by commanders for private use or as rewards, others earmarked for sale. A fragmentary letter attributed to a legionary, often cited by scholars as Marcus Flavius, captures a moment of that mundane cruelty without theatrical flourish. The fragment does not narrate explicit assault. It records movement and allocation in the tone of a soldier noting logistical details.
It is precisely the tone that is revealing. A human being treated as an item on a list, a life reduced to a notation in a military dispatch. Such fragments personalize a process that also appears again and again in much less human form: distribution lists, registers of captives, notes on status and destination. These documents translate conquest into property. If that sounds abstract, consider how the ritual worked politically. Public humiliation was a message for both the vanquished and the victors. For the conquered communities, the spectacle of exposed captives broadcast total domination. For Roman citizens, the parade translated distant violence into shared civic gain. The public stripping and parade made private transgression public policy. Humiliation served the state narrative of power. It eased the transition from wartime action to peacetime profits, allowing soldiers and urban elites to consume victory in the form of labor, sexual access, or resale. At the heart of this process lay bureaucracy. The machinery that turned people into assets involved lists, ledger entries, and taxes. Military reports often contained appendices, brief notes on numbers of captives, assignments to specific units, and suggested disposals. Campaign correspondence from the imperial period, including administrative reports associated with Trajan's reign, indicate systemized practices for handling captives. Distribution lists survive in fragmentary form. Ledgers from port cities and commercial centers record sales and transport contracts. Pompeian wall inscriptions and household accounts hint at the everyday reality that normalized such transactions. Branding and marking were part of this formalization. Documents and estate manuals describe the use of marks, sometimes applied to clothing, sometimes to skin or other close identifiers, to indicate ownership or the campaign of origin. The brand served multiple functions. It signaled legal status, deterred escape, and linked the captive to the fiscal system that would tax or profit from her labor. An estate treatise preserved in later compilations advises on the placement and management of such marks, treating them as part of inventory control. Inscriptions and occasional legal notes also indicate that the marks tied property back to specific commanders or campaigns, anchoring individual fates within an administrative chain of custody. Taxation and revenue considerations reinforced the logic. Captives were, in many records, recorded as taxable goods. Estate accounts and municipal records sometimes list human captives under asset columns alongside livestock or grain. This was not mere poetic shorthand. The incorporation of people into fiscal records meant that state and private actors could assess and collect dues on them. The financial dimension converted violence into municipal income and private profit, and it rationalized the presence of captive labor across urban economies.
Once processed, captives faced logistical channels designed as much for transfer as for concealment. Movement from the battlefield to urban depots, then to ships and warehouses, was a chain of custody with transit points that became sites of attrition. Textual evidence from Alexandria's commercial archives includes cargo ledgers that account for human freight alongside merchandise, noting numbers embarked and numbers received. Those documents do not dramatize loss, they record it. Estate and commercial treatises indicate that death during transit was expected and counted against permissible loss. Some operational manuals preserved in later sources mention attrition rates and normalize them as a cost of doing business, an economic evaluation that grimly acknowledged the human toll. On land, chained marches to central holding depots were common. Ships carried captives below deck, packed and out of sight, an arrangement that preserved the city's public image while ensuring the profitable concealment of human cargo. Warehouses and makeshift holding pens functioned as temporary marketplaces and storage centers, where captives awaited evaluation and eventual sale. The architecture of logistics here, the staging grounds, the docks, the escorted columns, reinforced a separation of spectacle and supply. Public humiliation displayed the victory. Private transactions and transfers converted it. Markets were the point at which policy became price. When the captive reached auction, the inspection ritual resembled livestock appraisal. Potential buyers examined health, age, physical condition, and utility. The comparisons here are deliberately clinical because the documents are. Price lists and market notes from ports and cities mention the destinations that determined valuation. Patrician households added servants. Some captives were assigned to state or private brothels. Others were resold to mine owners or workshop masters as laborers. Graffiti from Pompeii and marketplace inscriptions convey a grim normality in which brothel listings and advertisements coexisted with notices of other services, indicating that the sexual economy was woven into the urban fabric as an accepted industry. The legal and medical professions participated in this normalization. Estate treatises provide guidance on the management of concubines, slaves, and brothel turnover. Physicians' notes and gynecological handbooks often address practices for treating the bodies of women in servitude, not from therapeutic concern but as commercial maintenance. How to preserve usefulness and minimize loss. A physician named Soranus, in his medical observations, considers the treatment of women in servile contexts as part of his practice. His notes are clinical and devoid of moral judgment. Such writings reveal how expertise was marshaled to keep a system functioning, to sustain bodies as assets, and to manage their reproducibility or continued productivity. This normalization extended to legal instruments. Property law in the Roman world was extensive and sophisticated. When captives were entered into legal categories, their status became protected by contract, sale, and tax codes. Estate lawyers, municipal administrators, and imperial officials all operated within frameworks that accommodated the commodification of human beings. When a soldier received a captive as reward, when an urban elite purchased one for household labor, when a matron ran a brothel, the law provided mechanisms to register, transfer, and litigate ownership. Such legal structures did not create the abuse, they made it administratively durable. But amid paperwork and statutes, human voices sometimes break through the record. Blandina, an early Christian slave whose testimony survives through martyrdom accounts, offers one of the rare, anguished perspectives on enslavement and abuse. Her testimony, as preserved by Christian chroniclers, speaks less to administrative categories than to lived suffering and resistance. It names a human agent whose subjectivity refuses to be fully erased. Elsewhere, fragmentary inscriptions and narrative traces record instances of rebellion and resistance that unsettle the image of total domination. The Spanish revolt, led by a red-haired woman, retold in Roman accounts, became a cautionary tale for imperial chroniclers, precisely because it showed the possibility of defiance. Tacitus's references to tribal leaders like Boudica and the brutal reprisals recorded by historians such as Ammianus Marcellinus show that resistance was met with both military suppression and spectacular punishments designed to reinforce order. That resistance, when it appears in our sources, complicates any tidy sense that captives were passive recipients of fate. Letters and fragments show fear, resentment, and occasional attempts to escape or subvert the system. A legionary's dry notation of movement, like the fragment attributed to Marcus Flavius, becomes more than administrative detachment when read against evidence of escape or revolt. It betrays the cognitive dissonance of a society that could both admire valor and ignore violence. The soldier's shorthand becomes an index of moral distance. The brevity of the record points to how unlikely it was for institutions to register suffering in human terms. This bureaucratic and legal architecture extended the reach of violence far beyond the battlefield. The politics of memory completes the system of erasure. Triumphal arches inscribed with names and dates celebrate conquest while remaining mute about the lives erased in the process. Civic rituals honored victory and rewarded participation, while the documentation that recorded human dispossession remained in obscure ledgers, municipal vaults, or fragmentary archives. The monuments and coinage provided a public story. The ledgers, the margins of manuscripts, and the graffiti offered a quieter testimony.
Those marginal documents are crucial because they reveal the administrative logic that monuments conceal. The moral culpability is collective. It is not simply the fault of marauding soldiers or corrupt commanders. It is the product of institutions that organized and profited from the system. Municipal authorities taxed after sales. Merchants arranged transport. Physicians advised on maintenance. Legal professionals wrote the contracts that made sales possible. Respectable households, too, participated. Patrician families that acquired domestic labor, urban elites who used captive women as status markers, or managers who ran establishments that accepted state consignments. Popular culture, as preserved in graffiti and jokes, reflected and reinforced social attitudes that did not treat captives as whole persons. The economy and civic life of cities absorbed the profits of conquest and made them appear routine. To call this a system is to insist on pattern rather than singular atrocity. The documentary record, military appendices, port ledgers, estate treatises, physicians' notes, graffiti, and narrative histories, repeats variations on the same theme: capture, public display, classification, branding, taxation, transfer, sale, and institutional use. The repetition across different kinds of records argues for a continuity of practice. When a military dispatch lists captives as cargo, and a municipal ledger assigns a tax code to a recently acquired woman, we are witnessing 2 points on the same operational map. The intentionality is not always expressed in a single iconic decree. It is enacted through routine paperwork, which, by making the abusive ordinary, sustains it. There is another grim dimension worth confronting: the calculus of loss. Administrative texts and estate manuals indicate that death and illness among captives during transport or shortly after arrival were expected and calculated. Some treatises even quantify acceptable loss rates for long journeys or harsh assignments. The numbers appear in contexts where managers balance investment, risk, and expected turnover. This is not to reduce historical actors to cold accountants. It is to record that the system accepted attrition as part of its operations. A ledger that notes fewer individuals disembarked than were loaded at the port both registers a human catastrophe and makes it a line item in a commercial record. Markets, again, normalized this calculus through routine transactions. Auction records and market notices reveal how buyers assessed value. The criteria were often practical: age, condition, skills, and potential for labor. But the destinations tell us more about social logic than prices themselves. Captives went to private households as servants, to public or private brothels, to workshops, and to mines. Mining operations in particular were sites of extreme attrition, where captives worked in conditions that shortened lifespans.
The commercialization of disposability, through sale to mines, assignment to penal labor, or the transfer to brothels, was built into the economy. The medical literature and estate manuals are revealingly utilitarian in their approach. Physicians who treated captive women provided counsel on conditions of confinement, on managing infections or injuries that would otherwise reduce market value, and on reproductive control when appropriate to the buyer's intent. Estate managers advised on rotation and replacement. The tenor of these texts is managerial rather than moral. Health becomes a commodity concern, and medicine a tool to preserve asset performance. Serenus's notes, as one example from the medical corpus, are clinical and instructive rather than compassionate. This professional involvement functioned to legitimate and stabilize the system. Rare testimonies remind us that these records are not abstractions. Blandina's martyrdom account is a moral rupture in the archive. It insists on a personhood that the administrative record tried to efface. Other fragmentary voices, inscriptions scratched into walls, graffiti in marketplaces, a soldier's curt note, offer human textures that interrupt the ledger logic. And where resistances arose, whether organized rebellions under leaders such as Boudicca or uprisings in provinces, they forced Rome to confront the limits of its control. often responding with spectacular reprisals designed to reassert order through terror. How should we interpret this archive? One line of thought, uncomfortably straightforward, is that civilization and its administrative prowess can be marshaled to organize violence as efficiently as they organize grain or tax collection. Rome's legal and bureaucratic sophistication allowed it to convert human suffering into a managed economic activity with predictable procedures. That does not exonerate individuals. It indicts institutions, and by extension, the societies that sustain them. Civic participation, whether through cheering at a triumph or buying a servant in a city market, normalized the operations of dispossession. Where people profited or were complicit, accountability is diffuse but real. It is important, however, to avoid simplistic presentism. Context matters. Ancient legal categories, social hierarchies, and economic practices differ from modern ones. Yet the continuity of a mechanical logic, of turning persons into taxable assets, and of using paperwork to neutralize moral outrage, is disturbingly resonant across eras. Modern systems of organized sexual exploitation in war and trafficking make use of similar mechanisms: logistics, concealment, legal loopholes, and profit-driven normalization. Drawing parallels can be illuminating if done with nuance. The institutional grammar may repeat, even as the historical specifics diverge. What do monuments hide? The public story of Roman greatness, arches, panegyrics, and commemorative reliefs omit the ledger.
Temple facades and senator lists remember victory. Ledgers, graffiti, and fragmentary texts remember the human costs. To remember the victims is not to deny historical complexity. It is to read the record in full. The ledger entries and the medical notes are not peripheral. They are central evidence that the machinery of conquest functioned on multiple levels: the battlefield, the stage of humiliation, the desk of the administrator, the dock, and the marketplace. This interrogation has ethical teeth. History is not merely a collection of curiosities. It shapes civic memory. When societies celebrate military triumphs without acknowledging the systems of exploitation that made those triumphs profitable, they reproduce a selective memory that absolves the populace of responsibility. Monumental narratives sanitize, while documentary fragments insist on a different truth: the ordinary administration of atrocity. So what should we do with this knowledge? The first response is careful attention. Read primary documents where possible: campaign reports, port ledgers, estate treatises, physicians' handbooks, legal registers, and contemporary histories. The video description will include references and suggested readings to guide further inquiry. Second, cultivate a moral imagination that refuses to let monuments be the only story. Public commemoration can coexist with honest accounting of costs. Third, recognize the structural patterns. Bureaucracy can be a mechanism of harm as well as a tool of governance. Legal rationality can entrench injustice when it normalizes dispossession. The shocking truth, then, is not a lurid sensationalism, but an institutional fact. Roman victory was often accompanied by the organized, state-sanctioned capture and commodification of women, carried out through public ritual, formalized by paperwork, maintained by medical and legal practices, and normalized in markets and civic life. The archive does not simply show isolated cruelty, it exposes repeated procedures. This is the moral indictment. Efficiency and law can become instruments that render atrocity ordinary, and a civilization's capacity to bureaucratize life can also bureaucratize suffering. As we close, ask yourself a simple question. When we admire the sweep of history, its roads, its institutions, its technical achievements, whose costs do we forget? The chained figures in that imagined triumphal parade are not merely props for a narrative of glory. They are witnesses to a broader truth about human societies. Goodwill and brutality often share the same administrative grammar. To remember is to confront that grammar and to insist that civic memory include the ledger as well as the arch. If this investigation raised questions you want to explore further, please share this video with others and consult the primary documents and suggested readings listed in the description. Reflecting together keeps history honest and public memory accountable.